Okay, I am so excited to have you here, Nigel. This is welcome to Think Dyslexia Network. This is my YouTube channel. You can always follow me on Instagram at _Think Dyslexia, and I'm also on Twitter. So I am Dr. Lauren, and I always like to start off my interviews with letting my audience know that I am not an adult with dyslexia. I am just a special educator. Well, I don't want to say just, but I am a special educator. I've been a special educator for a decade, and I've worked in private and public schools. I've worked in specialized private schools for students with dyslexia in various places. And I feel it's critical to really bring awareness on a domestic and international level about what's going on in the schools, and where is dyslexia. So today, my guest is Nigel Atwell. And so he operates a solo law practice representing clients in the District of Columbia. So for those of you who don't know, that's our nation's capital. And he practices special ed law, employment law, and estate planning. And he is a former commercial lawyer who worked in-house for telecommunication companies and electric utilities. So Nigel is here, and we are going to discuss a few questions. So I think it's really important to let the audience know kind of what we're going to be unpacking. So then you kind of have an idea of how Nigel's going to answer those questions. So the first one really kind of focuses on the National Center for Education Statistics that revealed in 2020, 1 in 4 DC adults struggles in reading and 1 in 3 struggles in basic math. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and what Nigel has seen in his experience. The second question focuses on his experience as a DC public school teacher. And I know that he wore various hats and he was an elementary school teacher. So we're going to talk a little bit about what dyslexia looked like with the Black male students. Our third question is, I know that he is an education lawyer. I'm sorry, an educator and a lawyer. And so really, I want to know what his experience has been as an educator with dyslexia. Was there any training? And then the last question we'll kind of touch on, Nigel can open up a little bit about his practice and how people can obtain his services. So welcome, Nigel.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's my pleasure to be here. Absolutely.
Great. So let's get started. So currently, you are a lawyer specializing in special education law, among other things, in Washington, D.C. And so as I stated, the National Center for Education Statistics released new data in 2020, revealing that 1 in 4 DC adults struggle in reading and 1 in 3 adults struggle to do basic math. So does this data align with some of the clientele that you see, and how often is dyslexia discussed as the root cause?
I'm not surprised by that data at all. And you can think of that data in 2 ways. Let's say you're not from the District of Columbia and you're moving here for the first time and you're working in the area. There are a lot of really highly educated people here. People that have college degrees and advanced degrees. They're working on the Hill, or they're working in technology, or they're lobbyists or lawyers. Those are the people who make up the portion of the economy that you hear about when you think about Washington, D.C., right? But then again, you said 1 in 4 are struggling with reading. So if the people who we talked about that work in the economy that you hear about in DC, if that's the 75%, then who's the 25%? Well, when I think about the 25%, it's probably Black folks or people of color, and it's probably other marginalized groups that reside in the District of Columbia, but you don't hear about when you think about Washington, D.C. So in that sense, the data is not surprising to me. And it's also consistent with data that is existent about proficiency in reading in public schools. So if you look at the high stake tests that DC Public Schools takes, for example, the PARC, or the NAEP, which is an assessment, right, of reading and math, right? In both of those assessments, you look at the reading proficiency of Black students, who are by far the majority of students in District of Columbia Public Schools. Well, the reading proficiency, I think in 2019 was about 27%.
Okay.
That means about 27% of Black students who took the PARC were proficient in reading. So it's no surprise to me when you tell me that 25% of adults in Washington, D.C. are struggling with reading. I venture a good guess that the large majority of that 25% are African Americans, other people of color, or other marginalized people, such as people with disabilities who live in the district.
Mm,
So
that's fascinating. I mean, it's fascinating, but it's not. You know, it's just it's sad. It's
it
really
is.
sad.
It is. And you know, the thing about that is that when you're talking about public education, this you compare that reading proficiency that I just stated, 25, 26, 27% proficient in public schools, you got to look at it relative to the achievement of white students. So it's a significant gap, and the gap has been growing.
Right.
So, and now we have a pandemic. So I fully expect that that gap is going to continue to grow. It's going to be exacerbated by the pandemic. So the time is now to stop diagnosing this problem that we've had for years and years and years, and actually do something about it. Do something that actually works to increase reading proficiency at the public elementary school level, at the high school level, and beyond. It's time to do something.
So I definitely want to comment on the differences that you were talking about in Washington, D.C. So I actually worked at the Lab School of Washington for 1 year. And so for those of you who are not familiar with the Washington, D.C. area, it's in Georgetown, and it's a really affluent area. And I had, this was a specialized private school for students with language-based disabilities. And I would say when I was working there about 6 or 7 years ago, the tuition was about $40,000 for elementary school. And parents worked on the Hill. You know, parents were kind of what you said, the makeup of what people think outside of that area, what Washington, D.C. looks like. And just hearing this data about, you know, just the city within itself, comparing it to the counterparts of white folks, it's really, it's upsetting, you know, and I understand private schools, you need those specialized private schools for certain reasons, but not everyone can afford $40,000 a year for third grade. You know,
No, they can't. And
no,
it's $40,000 a year potentially until, you know, from third grade through high school. Who can afford that? Right?
Exactly.
Well, I'm sure if you go and look at the makeup of the lab school, that, you know, it's mostly white, upper middle class folks whose kids are attending there. And
Absolutely.
the question is for the 75% of Black children who are not proficient in reading, what is being done to ameliorate that problem? That's the issue of the day.
Well, and actually, I think that's a good transition for our next question to kind of talk about your experience as an educator. So you were an educator in DCPS for 7 years, and I know that you wore various hats in that capacity. But I know one of those hats was an elementary educator.
Yes.
So as a Black male educator in a predominantly Black city, did you feel, and I think we talked about this, was there a discrepancy between the Black and white students in regards to literacy and special ed services? If so, did you feel as an educator that you were equipped to support those young Black students?
Okay, so I'm going to answer that question from the perspective of my last experience, my last teaching experience. I taught in DC public schools, and my last school was a high-performing school in Georgetown in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
And notwithstanding that the school was located in Georgetown, it was primarily attended, the large majority of the students who attended were African American.
Okay.
And I think what you saw there was Black parents who entered the school lottery who were able to get their kids into that school. So I got to see a mixture of middle and upper middle class and rich white children attending schools with middle and often working class and low income Black children. And part of the reason why I left DC public schools to enter private practice is because I could not believe and understand the disparity in terms of addressing reading difficulties between Black and white children. So when you look at how teachers were trained and how schools, in particular that school, addressed reading difficulties in Black children, there was bias from in all parts of the infrastructure. So, you know, you rarely would see psychologists diagnose Black children with dyslexia. It just didn't happen. As we talked about earlier, Dyslexia is viewed, for example, it has this sort of stereotype, like it's something that it affects rich, highly intelligent white persons. You rarely hear about, or in public discourse, Black people having dyslexia. As a matter of fact, in my 6 years of special education practice, I've seen multiple white children diagnosed with dyslexia. Only one time have I seen a Black child diagnosed with dyslexia.
Wow.
So even from sort of the issue of identifying Black children as having dyslexia, there's bias there. From the perspective of teachers, giving reading instruction, I taught 5th grade, and often you at that level in that school and many other schools, you're not just teaching. I didn't just teach a group of kids who were on the same reading at grade level. I had kids that were reading at 5th grade level, 6th and 7th grade level, and then I might have had kids that were reading on the 1st grade level, teaching 5th grade, right? So there was always this issue: how are we going to improve the reading proficiency of those who are reading well below grade level? And you would just hear in teacher discussions about Black reading achievement. They don't read enough at home.
Yeah.
The family doesn't prioritize education. It's sort of victim blaming, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, these explanations for reading struggle in Black students, it didn't matter whether the Black student was a low income or working class family or a upper middle class Black family. I saw upper middle class children of Black families whose children were in 5th grade were reading 2 and 3 grades below grade level, and there was no research-based intervention provided to those children in order to raise their reading proficiency. And I would often ask the question of the parents when the kids came to me, like, was there any phonemics instruction? Was there any phonological instruction? Was there sight word instruction? No, we got none of that. And so you see that. So we just talked about diagnosis, intervention, and the bias that you see, I think certainly impacts what kind of results you get for Black children who are struggling with reading in public schools. And what was the second half of your question? I talked a lot.
No, actually, I think that you really hit on a lot of things. It was more so, did you feel like you were equipped to support them?
Yes, right. Well, I can tell you that as 5th grade, when you look at elementary schools, 5th grade is the upper part of elementary school.
Right.
So when I had students who were reading 2 and 3 grade levels below, and may or may not have been diagnosed with a disability, I didn't have the skills to teach basic reading. I didn't have the skills to give basic reading instruction. So in 5th grade and in the upper elementary grades, at that point, children are reading to learn. They're reading for comprehension, right? So they're reading social studies texts to understand what happened, what caused the Civil War. Right. But when your child is at the kindergarten or pre-K level or 1st grade, they are learning to read. And that's the difference. They're decoding. They're making associations between letters and sounds. They're doing they're performing a variety of other basic reading skills that your typical 5th grade teacher doesn't have the skills to teach, right? And so that was the struggle, and that continues to be the struggle. If you have a child that is having problems with those basic reading skills, or a child who's dyslexic, will a 6th grade teacher have the skills to intervene and to make a difference and improve the child's reading skills?
Well, and I think I want to touch on something you had said a while ago about psychologists that rarely diagnose Black students with dyslexia. Now, I found some research a while ago, and it was basically showing how students of color were more so diagnosed with an emotional disability or with an intellectual disability. And more than often, I think it's that bias that you were talking about. The teachers either see a young Black student
Mhm.
third, fourth grade as some sort of threat or something. I don't know what it is, but it's, obviously now, given the unrest in our country and a lot of literature that's come up with professional developments about white fragility and things of that nature, it's really critical for what I think a study had in 2017, 2018, there were 79% white educators and 5% Black educators. So if the majority of our educators are white, female, and then male, there has to be you got to unpack your own biases. So if you are a psychologist,
Yes.
it is okay to recognize that a student of color, maybe this is, dyslexia. And I think a lot of that comes to the behavioral aspect, which is why they assume, oh, this is an emotional disability. But what you have to understand as an educator, and really as a person, I feel like as a parent, behaviors are telling you something. So you can't just slap a band-aid and say, oh, well, this kid is emotionally
Absolutely.
disturbed. We need to send them to the resource room. We need to lock them up in that room
Absolutely.
with those kids with Down syndrome, or whatever the stigma is. You
Yes.
really need to figure out, well, every time I ask this student to read out loud, they always have to go to the bathroom. They always yell. They always do. Maybe pay
It's-
attention to that,
That's exactly right. It's exactly right.
right?
Teachers. So the issue that you're pointing to is bias. We've got to do
Yeah.
something about the bias. I mean, you stated the fact. If the workforce is primarily woman and it's white, and there is bias, and these are facts. There's bias in the system.
Hmm.
Then you got to unpack, deal with the bias, so that teachers, instead of looking at the skin color and stereotypes about the particular student, are looking at symptoms and are using checklists to identify behaviors that might be connected to some underlying cognitive or other problem.
Right.
That's exactly right. That's exactly the case. Exactly right.
So I think in the next question, I think you did answer this. And
Mhm.
so the question really kind of focused more on professional development. And I think just given your answers, you didn't have any professional development on dyslexia. And
No
that's
professional
not a
development.
shock.
No professional development, but at least in the District of Columbia and in many states, it appears that tide is changing. I think that was true before. Most
Mhm.
teachers aren't trained to identify or
No.
recognize symptoms of dyslexia. But as we talked about earlier, I believe that in 2019, there were over 70 bills in various states to
Right.
address this issue. And in the District of Columbia just enacted a law, and it was enacted without the signature of the mayor, which I think is not a good thing. Um,
Right.
but the act is a very, very long, it has a long name. I'm just going to call it the DC Dyslexia Act. But
Okay.
apparently what the act does is to start a pilot program whereby the state education agency, OSSI, is required to research and determine best practices for identifying dyslexia and other reading difficulties in public school children, um, as well as recommending professional development for teachers. It also requires District of Columbia Public Schools to actually provide professional development to its teachers
Mhm.
on dyslexia and other reading difficulties, right? And another thing that the act does, is that it requires sort of universal screening of children.
Yes.
So this way, if in fact does what it says it's going to do, universal means everybody's going to get screened. So it's
Exactly.
not just, well, this parent recognized something's wrong about
Right.
this kid, and this teacher recognized something's going on with this kid, and so
Right.
it's just a sort of whack-a-mole approach. All the kids are going to be screened, and I'm not sure how they'll do it, but the idea here is this is a system-wide problem. And I think we went to this race achievement gap. Well, 68% of the kids that attend DC public schools are African American. And if only 25% of those African Americans are reading proficiently according to state exams, then this can benefit a lot of children.
Yeah.
So there are steps. This is a step in the right direction. We
Absolutely.
have to see whether that act is going to actually be funded, whether it'll be
Yeah.
implemented, which is very, very important. It's going to be very expensive,
Yes.
but look at the mood of the country. I mean,
Yes.
the pandemic. The administration has just decided it wants to pass a $1.9 trillion bill to help people. You can't be worried about spending money now. This is the future of the education of children, and it will necessarily impact the economy and the economic fortunes of people who live in the District of Columbia. So it has to be
Absolutely.
done. Has to be done.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm looking at our time and I want to come to our final question, and this is about you. So
Oh,
you could tell us a little bit about your law firm and some of the special ed law that you do and maybe how people can obtain your services?
absolutely.
Anything you'd like to share?
Absolutely. So, as you noted, I'm a special education law lawyer. What I do is represent children who have either been determined to have disabilities under the federal law or children who are suspected of having disabilities. I represent them and their parents. I have a particular interest in representing disabled children who have been either harassed
Oh, wow.
or abused, actually physically abused, or otherwise excluded
Mm,
from educational programming and activities on account or because of their disabilities.
wow.
Another area that I've started to work on is doing estate planning for families that have children with disabilities.
Oh,
So
that's excellent.
things like special needs trusts,
Yes.
like particularly where children, their prospects for employment are really, really small. They need
Yes.
some support for social issues, activities of daily living, and the like when they're adults. So that's one part. I do also represent people in employment matters. So I focus on discrimination against people in the workplace on the basis of race or sex, sexual orientation, or
Okay.
national origin. And then, as you mentioned, I do some basic estate planning for what I'll call sort of regular families, right? So you have a couple with a couple of children, you have a house, two employed persons with 401k or some retirement plan.
Right.
Not rich people with lots of assets, but everybody needs estate planning. And again, in the pandemic, this is something that people have to pay attention to. You have to make sure that you have a financial power of attorney and that you also have a healthcare directive in the event that you are ill and can't speak for yourself, but you need someone to make a medical decision for you. So that's in sum what I do.
Wow. So, honestly, I just want to touch on the estate planning for families with children with disabilities. That is amazing because so on my Instagram account, I have dedicated content every day this month for Black history and disabilities. And I always want to bring awareness. That's just who I am as an educator. But like, I wasn't even thinking about that. And so
Yeah,
that is amazing because people do need to realize, as I always tell families and, just colleagues, like students that have learning disabilities in second, third grade, like they become adults too. Like, it doesn't disappear. And so when you think about that, you're right. I mean, that needs to happen. And I think
yes.
that's a good safety net. So they don't feel like, oh, if my parents pass away or whatever, like they have something to kind of fall back on. So that's
Absolutely, absolutely. That practice really is targeted towards children with disabilities who receive public benefits, right?
okay.
And the whole idea of the special needs trust, or at least the basic idea, is that if those children receive income or an inheritance, you want to make sure that they receive the money or they don't receive the money, so as to preserve their right to continue to receive those public benefits, right?
Right.
You don't want an inheritance to kick you out from whatever public benefits that you're receiving.
Right.
You want to,
Right.
it needs to be distributed in such a way that you can receive the benefit of the inheritance, but you can also continue to receive the public benefits that are so essential for your activities of daily living and other
Sure.
things that are important.
That's great. Well, you know what, Nigel, this was such an amazing conversation. It was empowering. I really feel that anyone who's watching this, please share this. Please, post it on your LinkedIn or anything. Like this conversation is really it's critical.
Yes.
So I thank you so much for your time, and I hope we will stay in touch and maybe do another one in the future.
I look forward to it, Lauren. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.